Hello everyone, Nar here. I'm going to be going over a Season 2 Dragonflight Dungeon tier list. This is primarily directed towards pickup groups. I've done these dungeons with knowing one party member to all party members. I've done all these dungeons with guildies, but I'm going to be primarily focusing on pickup groups as I've tanked all of these dungeons as well as DPS'd all of these dungeons. And I'd like to give some input as to the difficulty and where they scale in terms of whether you know your party or you don't know your party. That can be the biggest killer of some of these dungeons. So for starters, we have Brackenhide Hollow. I'd say the biggest thing about Brackenhide Hollow is going to be whether your party is comfortable in the dungeon or not. I know that can be said about a lot of these dungeons, but this one specifically because there is a route that needs to be taken in which you can get either exactly 100% or only pull over 100% by just a little bit. And an inexperienced tank may need a bit more guiding than you may have hoped for, or a DPS comp that just might not work. It can be a bit tough, especially if it's, say, late at night and it's hard to get the comp that you want, but of course any of the classes and specs can hit plus 20 keys pretty easily. I will say the most inexperienced players will struggle with the very first boss, Hackclaw's Warband. That is because you will have to either focus down Trick Totem or Gash Tooth. Gash Tooth will absolutely murder your party if the defensives are not pressed at the right time. So whenever he does his little jumping around ability where he hits everyone once and puts a bleed on them, that's, if you have enough defensives you can deal with that with a defensive, but for the most part that's more of a healer check. It's whenever Gash Tooth goes and starts focusing on one of your party members, that is the time to use a defensive or bubble or whatever have you. Because if you don't deal with that, then he's just going to keep going until you're dead. And the healer won't be able to catch up. And especially in higher keys, if you don't have a defensive ready, then you're just done for. And the Hackclaw, Rira Hackclaw, whenever he goes to do the Savage Charge, I believe it's called, if you don't have a paladin in your group, you can't Blessing and Protection it. Or if you have a tank that isn't sure what to do on that mechanic, you might want to give them a bit of a heads up, because it is a 10-second cast, so you have time to hopefully have them see it, in the party chat. But for the most part, the tank needs to stand in front of the red arrow so that he can block the damage or Blessing of Protection. That's another mechanic that can be a bit iffy, along with his Whirlwind. Everyone just needs to, whoever's targeted just needs to run out of the group. It's pretty simple on that end. And then Trick Totem, of course, is just pummeling or, interrupting the spellcaster for greater heal. Otherwise, it's not too difficult after that. Once you get rid of Gash Tooth, he is absolutely the pug killer if he is not dealt with right away. Tree Mouth and Gutshot are very, very simple, easy to explain, a one-sentence mechanic, super duper simple. And then you get to Wrath Eye. Wrath Eye is the quintessential last boss that can make or break the key. There have been so many times where we will get to this boss, we will be smooth sailing, but all of a sudden we just have, it's almost like a snowball going downhill. Once someone gets hit by even one of the either totem casts going off or even dips their toe into the circle of the little breath that she spews, it can be pretty much a one and done. it may completely destroy the key. She is so finicky. Of course, there are more advanced techniques that, need to be learned and practiced in lower keys before you get into higher keys, such as whenever she pukes her breath in one direction, you'll want to run her to the opposite side, because she'll always spawn her totem on the opposite side of where she is. So if you get ahead of the breath by running her to the opposite side of the boss arena, she will spawn the totem way ahead of where the breath will be. So for that, I think I'm going to give Brackenhide Hollow a solid B. There are enough mechanics in this dungeon that can be dealt with by 1 or 2 people to make the key successful, but it's hard to call it an A tier when there are 2 bosses that have mechanics that can just completely annihilate the key. Next we have Freehold. So with Freehold, everyone says it is absolutely one of the easiest keys, as easy as Underrot. I will say that up to a point. The mechanics of each of the bosses are very simple, and when it comes down to the tank routing, it can be a bit more difficult if the tank isn't sure of how to go about it. If you're not a tank player, it can be very, almost mind-boggling as to how many different routes there are in this dungeon in order to get to 100%. Freehold, just like Brackenhide Hollow, has a lot of trash to kill. So in order to get 100% or not over pull 100%, there needs to be absolutely no butt pulling, accidentally backing up into packs, pulling the wrong trash that may be too difficult and waste more time on the key. As a tank player going into Season 2, Freehold was the first dungeon that I almost wanted to quit the season because I didn't practice any of the routing. Someone going in completely blind into Freehold may just lose their mind before they even get to the first boss. Because unless someone in the party tells you what to do to get to the first boss, that right there could be just an absolute nightmare. You could rack up like 30 deaths easily. Because if the tank does the first triple pull, and then he goes up into the left towards the boss where the road, the road to the boss, all of that trash is absolutely a nightmare to deal with. And there's nothing telling you besides someone in the party saying, hey, why don't you go to the right and take these 4 guys around the pillar here so they can't shoot us. And then we'll kill them over here, and then we'll go back a little and kill this pack to trigger the boss. If you try to go left, it is so easy to have the packs come onto, like, literally just pile onto you. Because you're not only going to have butt pulls, but some of the packs that don't say that they're connected are connected. Like, there have been so many times where I tried to, at the beginning of the season, I would try to pull the patrol with the first set of ads underneath that little tent, and it would actually pull the guys by the boss for some reason. And I don't know why it doesn't work the other way around, because whenever you let the patrol go far enough, whenever you do it the correct way, it doesn't pull the patrol at all. So I'm not sure how that works. I don't know why that's like that, but Freehold, as long as you have a tank that knows what they're doing and you have DPS that can watch their feet, Freehold is definitely one of the easiest keys. It is an absolute AoE stomp. Go into the best AoE build you can and you'll destroy this key. It is so fun as a DPS player. It can be a bit of a headache as a tank player. I've noticed that a lot of people tend to try and, before they go over the bridge to the last boss, they try to route their way behind the building to go over that bridge to get to the Ring of Booty. And there's a patrol that goes underneath the bridge, and that can be absolutely a pug killing nightmare, because there are some AoE abilities that will pull that trash under. If the tank knows what they're doing, they'll pull the trash on the bridge back towards the building so they can't trigger that patrol. But anytime that I have been in a pickup group, we will always wipe at least twice on that trash before we're just like, hey, can we just go straight through to the center of the Ring of Booty? It's so much safer and so much easier, and you get the percentage that you need. If you need to pull anything else, you could just pull it while the pig RP is going. So it's just that, those are the finicky things about Freehold. But other than that, all the bosses are super simple, very easy. Such easy mechanics. The last boss can be a bit overwhelming by the time he's under 30%. But other than that, it's quite a treat. It's a delight. I'll put it at A tier. Just because the only thing holding you back in Freehold is just a bit of an inexperienced party. That's it. Everything else is super simple. Next we have Halls of Infusion. I do not like Halls of Infusion at all. It is one of the most mechanically heavy dungeons for a pug group to handle, and it can only be remedied by being in a party with comms, or just being a very experienced Halls of Infusion player. There's no doubt in my mind that I will eventually be able to plus 20 this, but as someone who's more on the casual end, just trying to lightly pug in where I can or play with guildies as needed, this has to be the dungeon that I have had so many people rage quit, go offline. Whenever we die halfway through the dungeon, they don't want to walk back, and then they just completely leave. Or there will just... It's such a tilting dungeon because of the way that the respawn is. Why is the respawn all the way at the beginning of the dungeon? It makes no sense. Along with how mechanically heavy a lot of the mobs are. There are so many things that can make or break a pull because of one mob getting a cast off. Like, why is it that the containment beams from the stupid little balls, why can they all target the same person? That makes no sense to me. And it's like, okay, you can tell me all day, yeah, chain your stuns, but if you're not in comms, and you have no way of telling people like, hey, I'm going to stun this one, then you're going to double, potentially triple, quadruple stun the same guy to get him out of the containment beam. And a simple change would be to, okay, if one is targeting with their containment beam, then another one can't be targeted by it. I just don't understand why it is someone can be triple targeted by the beams and then just gone. Like, if they don't pop ice block fast enough, done. If they don't pop bubble fast enough, done. If the stuns don't go out, done. Like, it's so frustrating to deal with in pugs. It's obviously a bit easier whenever you're, having a party that you can be like, okay, I'm gonna stun circle, I'm gonna stun moon, I'm gonna stun triangle, but it's absolutely frustrating. And then, not to mention, the only boss that has mechanics that are easy enough to deal with, I would say, would probably be Gulping Goliath. Because that's just not only a huge healer check, but it's also a DPS check to get as few frogs out as possible, along with having them maintain their DPS rotation, but also try to clump all the frogs into one area. I'm sure there's plenty of strategies out there, but a majority of players probably don't even look at that stuff. So then you have people sitting there just getting eaten by a frog, not doing anything, maybe not even DPSing the frog that's eating them, and then they die at 10 stacks of poison. And you have to tell the DPS to, hey, like, guide your frogs across the gulping Goliath so that whenever he does his gulp, he eats all the frogs. Simple mechanic, one sentence explanation, but in practice, it can be a bit difficult in a pug because they may be focusing too much on their health, they may be focusing too much on their rotation, they may be focusing too much on not getting hit by the stones that are falling down, and then all of a sudden they got 4 frogs on them and their poison's building up, they're panicking, you know. You don't know what's going on in these pugs' heads, and it's hard to kind of calm them down and like guide their train of thought if you're not in comms with them. The third boss, Kaijin the Unyielding, she's not too bad. The only thing that really needs to be talked over is where the tank is going to tank her, because you can all hide behind the same perfect ice block. It just needs to not be anywhere near the broken ones. And then after that is the Primal Tsunami. The only thing about Primal Tsunami that can kind of suck is if the infuse gets interrupted a little bit too early and then too many inundates go off. So what I like to do is to kind of communicate to my team, like, hey, if you're going to interrupt, then it's your job to stun during inundate, and then we'll kind of cycle through stuns on that. Otherwise, Primal Tsunami is just a watch your feet and try not to get hit by any of those globules running back. But all in all, the trash in this dungeon is what absolutely destroys people. Even the first amount of trash leading up to the first boss, going all the way to every boss in between. Like the little hallway from the Gulping Goliath to the Kaijin lady, it's an absolute nightmare. If you even overpull by a little bit, you might as well just count your blessings if you survive. It is so difficult on higher keys. And there are some ways to deal with the trash, but if there's no communication at all, and some pugs just won't even talk to each other, they won't even communicate. If something goes wrong too many times, they'll just leave. I'm giving Halls of Infusion a definite D tier. It is the hardest one for pugs to do. It is the hardest one to go into with a group that's inexperienced in higher keys. And the only way that you can convince me that this would be higher up on the list is maybe if you told me, like, hey, all the bosses are super simple, but the trash is deadly. Don't even get me started on fortified Halls of Infusion. That is a nightmare. I almost never want to touch that dungeon again once I time a higher key on that. And going on further, we have Neltharian's Lair. Not much to say about this one, just because we all know the pain points. Fortified pelters are so deadly. You have to chain stuns, you have to just be coordinated on that. The tank routing is very straightforward. There's like maybe 2 or 3 spots where it can differ depending on how your tank wants to run it. But otherwise, if you just go straight through one shot, it's pretty easy to deal with all the trash. The other thing is the Earthbreaker guys, or whatever they are. Whenever they do the avalanche, that can be tough if people are stacked in the same circle, and that'll one-shot people. But it's mostly, the biggest pain point here is the pelters and the worm boss. I'd say last boss a little bit if people don't know what they're doing, because I've had plenty of people I'd have ranged people stand too far away from the boss, so I'd have the boss here and ranged way back here. They get the earth wall on them, but now the tank has a decision to make of, ooh, do I move the boss a little bit closer and just kind of hope my healer takes the hint that the wall's too far away? Or do I just leave him here and then the earth elemental makes his way over, damaging the whole party like crazy, and hope that no one dies? That's kind of the toss-up decision that you'd have to make. And the worm boss just feels still a bit overtuned if you don't have the DPS, but otherwise it's not too bad. The biggest thing that'll frustrate people are the pelters here. I'd give this a solid B tier. It's not the worst, but it's not the best. It can be annoying at times, but it's nothing too miserable. Next is Neltheris. Neltheris is a weird one for me because the mammoth is mostly the point of contention here. It can be very difficult to coordinate of, hey, I'm going to tank him facing this wall here, but then you guys all need to stand back here, and then we need to try and figure out how we can get the mammoth to bounce, charge towards you guys. You all move, and then we kind of pick a different spot so there's not lava everywhere, one, but it's also easier to dodge the lava globules, two. So that can be a very hard one for pugs. I don't think I've done Magma Tusk on a high key without at least 2 people dying. In a pug group, unless you have like everyone's kitted out, everyone can handle even one like lava globule, which is very tough. And just a tank that knows what they're doing. All the DPS are pumping, so there's as few charges as possible. It can still be a nightmare of a boss. Everyone else in this dungeon isn't too bad. The Chargath, if the chains aren't broken one by one, and they're broken all at the same time, then that's pretty much a wipe on high keys. I've had it to the point where we've had 2 stacks of the chain debuff, and half the party was gone before the debuff was up. So that one can be tough because it's a little bit more coordination than you'd like, because sometimes, if you got a demon hunter in your party and they need to do their fell rushes and stuff and they got the chain attached to them, like, they need to be the first ones to break their chain so they don't lose DPS. But if even one person messes it up by accident, or even just like the boss can be a bit finicky moving him around and you double break a chain, then it's a healer's nightmare. It can be really tough. And then same with the last boss. If people aren't picking up the gold piles and using them to break her shield, you may as well count the party dead, because it is very difficult to do unless you're having everyone grab something to break the shield. As for the trash, unfortified it's a little bit more difficult, but on tyrannical the trash is such an ease to breeze through. Nothing really stands out as being too difficult. I'd say the biggest amount of trash is more towards the end, going up to the last boss, those last 2 pulls or so. That trash can be a bit difficult for the healer because of the birds with the blazing wing, and then the lady that keeps spawning out the fire elementals if the shield isn't broken and she's interrupted. That can be a tough one to deal with. So I'd say for this one, solid C tier. I've had groups that actually absolutely smash it, but I've had more groups either fail the key or drop out of the key entirely. Going on next, we have Uldaman. Uldaman is... I feel it's a tough one to kind of put into a solid place, because I've had some people either like Neltheris, well, they'll destroy the key or they'll fail out of it. And I'd say I would contribute that more so to Bromok. If you can't get past Bromok, you may as well just lower the key and see if they want to do it, the pug wants to do it on lower key. That one can get so hectic and people can get so overwhelmed on higher difficulties because of the ads. It is so hard to get all the ads together and keep interrupting that one Geomancer that always spawns. Get them all clumped together and then DPS down the totem, because in a PUG you're not going to have enough communication to be like, hey, get everyone in the center, and then once the totem comes up, DPS the totem as fast as possible. Some people may not see the totem. Some people may not know when the totem's up. Some people, are so focused on killing the mobs and the boss that they don't even realize the totem is there. So that one can be the most difficult, because if the totem isn't dead before he bloodlusts, then it's going to be very, very hard for the healer to keep up. Because he starts spawning not because of the bloodlust, but he just keeps continuously spawning ads, sometimes before the last ads aren't even dead. So then you get to this point where I've had as many as 8 to 12 mobs up at a time, and we're still killing maybe the second or third totem. And it can be very, very snowbally because he keeps spawning the ads. But if you're able to deal with him, then you're going to be able to deal with the rest of the dungeon, because everything is super easy. I'd say for healers, they have a hard time with the snake boss because of the bleed that she puts on them. And it can kill anyone that, like a hunter that doesn't have a lot of defensives, it can just annihilate them. But if you have a party that's well equipped with defensives, if you have a healer that knows to just really power out the heals on whoever's getting that bleed on them, then you're golden. The rest of the dungeon is super easy. The last trash before the boss you can actually skip now. So the last two guys that would always put the debuff on everyone, that is just a huge ticking dot. You can skip those guys by jumping onto the pillar and jumping over onto the ledge. You don't even need Mind Soothe for that, so I'm thankful that that was figured out. But other than that, all the trash super easy. Even on Fortified, it's not even that bad. Maybe on Fortified, the Basilisks are a point of contention still, where you kind of have to kite them around if they got their Spike Carapace and you got like triple chomp on you. But other than that, Ultimate I'd say is a solid A tier for me. I have not seen many groups where we go in and we don't just annihilate the key. It's super simple. Last boss is super fun. I like the huge amount of haste that you get from it. Again, Bromok is a nightmare to deal with. Otherwise, Ultimate would be an S tier for pugs. But it's just super straightforward, super easy routing. There's almost no way you can mess up the routing as a tank. All you gotta learn as a tank is like where to pop certain defensives on what packs. It's no like crazy mechanically heavy. All the bosses are easy. And moving on next, we have the Underrot, the key that a lot of the professional WoW players say should be buffed because it's so easy. I'd say the biggest problem with that is they're not really looking at it from a standpoint of what it's like to deal with inexperienced pugs. Because anywhere from the 9 to 15 key range, you'll get people that don't know the Kragmaw trick, where everyone kind of stands in one place and the tank will tank him into the bones. So whoever gets the charge, he doesn't charge that far, you get all the ticks. And then sometimes people hate Kragmaw so much that they will go do the third boss and then come back to Kragmaw, because they will have Lust up because they use Lust on the first boss, so then they have it up for Kragmaw if they do the third boss first. I'd say the last three bosses, it's so weird because the first boss is so easy, it gives everyone a false sense of hope in lower keys. So an inexperienced group going into it is going to be like, oh, this is literally going to be so easy, because the first boss, dog shit. So you sometimes can even just completely ignore her mirrored image because she's so stupidly easy. But once you get into the trash room of Cragmaw, well, oh shit, a lot of this trash hits hard. And yeah, okay, you can ignore the little swarmers or whatever that lock on the people, but people are so focused on how the swarmers can be dealt with by just ignoring them, they fail to see that there is no reasonable way in a big pull to see which way the fetid maggot is facing. So if you're unlucky enough to not realize, oh, the fetid maggot is looking in my direction, you're gonna die because of how fast it ticks. It chunks your health down so fast that if you're in that spray for even 2 seconds, you may as well just be dead. There needs to be some sort of way that it shows which way these stupid little maggots are going to be facing. Because I've had pugs that will just get obliterated by the trash because they're not watching the maggot. And, you know, as a melee player, it's easier for me, or as a tank player, it's easier for me because he's never going to shoot it at me. Or as a melee player, he's going to shoot it in my direction, but I could just sidestep it. But the cone on the stupid maggots is wider than how it looks coming out of his mouth. So if you get a cone like this and you're standing over here, it's potentially still going to hit you because of the way that the animation is. It doesn't make any sense, and there needs to be more visual representation for stuff like that. And going into the third boss, if your pug doesn't know how to deal with the mushrooms, obviously it's a lot easier as a paladin, because if there's too many mushrooms up, you just bubble and pop all the mushrooms and then you're good. But if your DPS aren't kind of going, say you're going clockwise around the room, and they're going to start popping stuff counterclockwise to where you are. So you start here, your DPS starts here, and then it should just come to a complete circle of popping all the mushrooms. And then say if there's like 5 up still, since I'm a paladin, I can just pop the last 5, cleanse myself before the AoE goes off and everyone gets those 5. That one can be really tough in pugs because it's a lot harder to coordinate. It's just as simple as that. It can be so much harder to coordinate. Hey, you can tell them in the party chat, sure. Like the most amount of, pug communication is going to be through party chat, or just kind of whispering someone like, hey, you seem to know what you're doing. Like, I'm going to do it this way. You can do it this way. And then you get the mechanic done. But the biggest point of contention is whenever you're pugging, unless you have a way to know beforehand of what server the person is coming from, they could potentially not even speak any English at all. And that can be the thing that is going to make the key so much harder. You're trying to explain a mechanic one way, but he doesn't understand the language. And, it's nice that we can play with players like that and, kind of get that experience, but it can be a lot more difficult in dungeons that have a very simple mechanic, but it's very hard to communicate how you're going to do it versus how they're going to do it. So I'd have to give Underrot a solid B tier because the dungeon may not be mechanically heavy, but it's more so that it's very, very overwhelming for pugs if they're even the slightest bit inexperienced or don't do the either routing or mechanic the exact way that certain other people do it. Because if you do Cragmaw, say one person doesn't know Cragmaw, even though you may ask like, oh, does anyone not know it? Say you're in a 15. One person not knowing it can be the death of the party, because now Kragmaw is going to have 3 people over here, the tank over here, and then the DPS is lost in the sauce, and this DPS is getting charged at, and he's going to the other side of the room. And then now the tank's got to work to help pop the ticks, but also drag him back to where he is. And that can be difficult because he starts to charge so often, and then especially whenever he gets into his tantrum, it just gets so overwhelming with everyone trying to pop ticks, but then they miss a tick, but then a tick is on them, and then they're getting the stacking bleed, and then now the tank has to pick them all up, and if the DPS isn't able to get all the ticks killed, then you're pretty much done for on that boss. And then the last boss especially, whenever you learn the last boss, I'm a bit biased because I'm a paladin player, but whenever you tank the last boss as a paladin, sure, he puts stuff on the ground whenever he spits at you. However, if you're a paladin player, whenever the little spittles turn into like those orbs or whatever that start to float towards the party, you could just throw a shield and hit 5 of them and then pop them in place in the middle of the room where you're not even going to go. So at a certain point, my party got overwhelmed. This was like a 13 or 14 underrot. On the last boss, I had all the little globules following behind the boss, but I was able to continuously pop behind him because I was just throwing my shields at him. So I had almost a clear way behind me as I went, and then of course, since I was the only one alive, I kept cleansing the areas that may not have been safe enough, but still. The underrot for pugs, in a pug setting specifically, can be a hit or a miss. If everyone knows what they're doing, great, you're going to crush the shit out of that key. If even one person doesn't know what they're doing, it can be a serious slog. It may be butt pulling, it may be not dealing with the trash properly, it may not be stunning properly, it may not be dealing with the mushrooms. There's so much that can go wrong if you have even one inexperienced player, that first boss gives that false sense of security. And that's why it's just going to stay in B tier. Next we have Vortex Pinnacle. So Vortex Pinnacle, I know a lot of people that hate this dungeon. I, for one, it's alright. I really don't like the Mistral guys in the beginning. They're just such a slog to kill on Fortified. Like, my god. I don't think I've ever seen a boss that was more... a mob group that was more annoying than them, because as a melee player, you don't get to sit there and just hack away at them. You gotta get out of their AoE. You gotta come back in. You gotta get behind them whenever they put up the guard. Like, it's just mechanically annoying. It's not difficult. It's not hard. It's not whatever. It's just annoying at that point. And then the little dudes going up to the first boss, the ones that wind rush people. Now that is a dot that can annihilate on higher keys if it's not cleansed properly or popped a defensive for. Other than that, the mechanics of each of the bosses aren't too bad. The first boss, pretty easy to deal with. It's more of a healer check than anything. Otherwise, it's just interrupt lightning bolt and not stand in any of the tornadoes and whatever. The second boss is kind of hit or miss. It's a lot easier on melee, but as ranged, I can definitely understand, because I did it on my mage, of how overwhelming it can be, because you're trying to do your rotation over in the southern area, and then you have to go move to northern, but then he shoots his breath in that northern area, so you got to move slightly to the western area. And for a melee player, it's just, it's super easy as melee, but as a ranged, I can understand the contention there. And then all the trash is pretty easy to deal with. The trash that can be a pug killer is the 5 guys right before you jump off the side to go to the last boss. I actually had a DK tank one time tried to go in with all 5 of them still up, like we didn't polymorph any of them, and he just got obliterated, like one shot. I'm talking not even able to get enough runic power to get one death strike in. He was just gone. And so eventually we had to, I think we had a shaman or a mage that either hexed or polymorphed it so that we could just take on the 4, and then we had to start rotating stuns as well as a pug could and interrupting the rallies. But eventually we got through it. I'd say that trash, you have, depending on how fast your tank is pulling and going through the routing and how good the DPS is at killing the bosses, that might be the pack that makes or breaks you. Honestly, because you may have too short of a time on the timer to kill the last boss after that, or the little star thingies, if your healer is even a little bit behind on healing, you can just lose time just there by people dying, because that trash is pretty difficult on Fortified. Other than that, the last boss is pretty easy. I'd say Vortex Panel Hole gets, it's going to be somewhere between B or C, I feel. I'll put it at the I'll put it at the top of C for now, just because the trash isn't super difficult, but the bosses can for sure overwhelm people. That's the biggest thing here. Especially on Tyrannical, when everything just hits super hard, and if the last boss's little AoE sky ball piece of shit keeps going off for too long, then your whole party's just going to be dead before he even gets the static cling out. So unfortunately this season, no S tier. I would say all of these are decently pug friendly. As I'm getting into more higher keys, I'm seeing more experienced players. Of course, there are still players that aren't sure what's going on. Maybe they need more practice on lower keys, but I'm now consistently getting into the 15 and 16 range, where people are knowing the dungeons more and more, understanding all the little shortcuts and all the little niche things for some of the bosses. So as of now, this may change as I get more experienced and with more experienced people in pugs, but for now, I believe this is a pretty accurate representation of how the pug life is going in terms of all of these Season 2 dungeons. I hope you all enjoyed, and see you in the next one.